The hall fell silent as Captain Callan Thorne walked past 11 perfect princesses, past diplomats who could bring star systems in dowry, past warriors whose skin glowed with power and prestige. He stopped in front of the scarred one, the unwanted one, the princess everyone had forgotten. He pulled a broken blade fragment from his pocket, a decade-old secret carved in obsidian, pointed it at her face. Her. The entire empire thought he'd lost his mind. The desert wind carried the smell of burning flesh and the sharp metallic tang of fear. Sarah was 18 years old the first time she chose mercy over orders, and it cost her everything. Cinder Ridge, 10 years ago, the thermal territories of Nevada, where the Vorshai 4th Legion had trapped 35 American soldiers in a collapsed lava tube. The men huddled in the darkness like cornered animals, their breathing ragged and desperate in the suffocating heat. Some were praying, others were silent faces pale beneath the grime and blood. They knew what came next. Everyone knew what came next. Sarah stood at the entrance to the cave, her obsidian blade humming with suppressed thermal energy. Behind her, the 4th Legion waited for the order. Her father's voice crackled through the calm implant, embedded in her jaw, cold and absolute as stone. Execute them. Leave no survivors. The Terrans must learn that defiance carries a price. She was the youngest commander in Vorshai history, a prodigy. The blade in her hand had been forged from her mother's bones, a weapon that should have sung with glory as it carved through the enemy. But as Sarah looked into the cave, all she saw were boys. Some couldn't have been older than 16. One of them was crying, trying to muffle the sound with his filthy sleeve. Her thermal vision picked out the details with cruel clarity. A photograph tucked into one soldier's vest pocket, the edges worn soft from constant handling. Dog tags hanging from trembling fingers, reflecting the orange glow of her blade. A face half obscured by shadow blue eyes watching her with the kind of resignation that comes just before death. Not pleading, not begging, just waiting for the inevitable. Acknowledged warlord, Sarah heard herself say. Her voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. She stepped into the cave. The soldiers flinched back, pressing against the stone. One raised his hands, not in surrender, but in a futile gesture of protection, as if human flesh meant anything against obsidian heated to incandescence. Sarah looked down at the blade in her hand, the weapon her mother had carried for 40 years before falling to shadow eaters at the edge of the thermal territories. The symbol of everything she was supposed to be: legacy, duty, unquestioning obedience to the chain of command. Then she looked at the 35 faces staring back at her, waiting for the mercy they knew wouldn't come. Some were whispering prayers, others held photographs, letters, scraps of a life they'd never get back to. She saw dog tags marked with blood types and religious preferences: Protestant, Catholic, Jewish. None of it would matter in 30 seconds when her blade turned them to ash. She drove the blade into the cave floor. The obsidian shrieked as it struck basalt, a sound like a dying star. The cave walls rang with it. Then Sarah gripped the hilt with both hands and snapped the weapon in half. The crack echoed through the cave like thunder. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. The soldiers stared at her. The broken pieces of her mother's blade lay on the stone floor, still radiating heat. Sarah felt something inside her chest break with the same finality. There's a steam vent 300 meters north, she said in broken English words she'd learned from forbidden texts smuggled into the Citadel library. The thermal sensors are jammed for the next 8 minutes. Run. The soldiers stared at her. One of them, the blue-eyed man in the shadows, started to speak. Sarah cut him off with a sharp gesture. Run, or my hesitation kills us both. They ran. Sarah stood alone in the cave, holding the broken pieces of her mother's blade, and waited for her father to discover what she had done. She didn't have to wait long. The 4th Legion's combat recorders had captured everything. The video would be on Draven's tactical display within minutes. The punishment came 3 days later. A public ceremony in the Grand Hall of the Nevada Citadel, witnessed by every high reaver in the thermal territories. Her father's armored hand gripping her jaw, forcing her to her knees on the obsidian floor. The stylus, heated to white incandescence, dragged across her face from temple to jawline with deliberate, agonizing slowness. The scar tissue burned crimson against her deep red skin, a brand that marked her as defective, broken, a blade that had failed its purpose. You are no daughter of mine, Draven had said, his voice devoid of emotion. until you learn that mercy is the luxury of the weak. For 10 years, Sarah carried that scar like a chain. She told herself it was punishment, told herself she deserved the whispers, the sidelong glances, the way other warriors fell silent when she entered a room. She buried herself in exile, studying forbidden human texts in abandoned outposts, where no one had to see the shame she wore on her face. She became the best fighter no one wanted, the princess everyone forgot, until tonight. The Nevada citadel rose from the desert like a monument to conquest, a fortress of obsidian and heat-resistant steel that housed the Hegemony Council's uneasy alliance. 50 years had passed since the Vorshai landing, 50 years of Cold War and colder treaties. The thermal territories belonged to the fire-skinned invaders who had dropped from the sky in ships that looked like falling stars. The temperate zones remained human, and along the borders where the two species met in mining colonies and trading posts, there was only suspicion and the memory of blood. Tonight, the Grand Hall blazed with ceremonial light. Thermal crystals suspended from vaulted ceilings cast an orange glow that made the assembled delegates look like demons from ancient Earth mythology. Vorshai nobility stood in rigid formations, their armor polished to mirror brightness, skin glowing in shades that ranged from deep crimson to pale violet. Human dignitaries clustered near the exits, hands never far from concealed weapons, sweat beading on foreheads despite the temperature regulation. The air tasted of ozone and political theater, and the particular tension that comes when two species who've killed each other for generations try to pretend they're civilized. Sarah stood at the far end of the hall, separated from the other 11 princesses by 20 feet in a lifetime of shame. She wore ceremonial armor that had been gathering dust in storage for a decade, black plates scratched and dented from years of hard training. No ornamental glass robes that shimmered with each breath. No jeweled daggers strapped to her thighs to demonstrate wealth and status. Just functional battle gear and the scar that marked her as the one they didn't talk about. The other princesses were everything Sarah was not. Polished, poised, skin glowing in shades of violet and soft crimson that spoke of noble bloodlines and political value. They stood with the casual confidence of women who had never questioned their worth, never wondered if they deserved the space they occupied. Princess Vera, daughter of the Eastern Reach, her energy field humming with barely restrained power that made the air around her shimmer. Princess Kael, whose diplomatic corps had brokered the Midwest Accord that prevented 3 human states from open rebellion. 11 perfect candidates for the union that would bind Earth and Vorshai interests in a treaty neither side believed in. And then there was Sarah, the broken blade, the defective daughter standing at the end of the line like an afterthought. Through the crowd, she caught fragments of conversation, human delegates whispering behind raised hands, their words carrying farther than they thought in the echoing hall. A hegemony count gesturing toward her scar with barely concealed disgust, his jeweled fingers tracing the shape of it in the air. The words drifted through the hall like smoke. That's the one who let the Terrans escape. Draven's shame. Why is she even here? Political theater. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the obsidian floor and tried to remember how to breathe. The Cortex bridge technology had been explained to her 3 times by 3 different hegemony physicians, each one speaking slower and louder, as if she were mentally deficient rather than merely disgraced. Bonded mates would share a neural link, a fusion of nervous systems that allowed them to feel each other's pain, sense each other's thoughts, experience of the world through double perception. It was supposed to create unbreakable loyalty, a living chain between species. In practice, it meant whoever chose her would be shackled to a failure, would feel her shame through the bond every waking moment, would carry the weight of her defection like a stone around their neck. The Imperial Herald's voice boomed across the hall, echoing off stone and trapped starlight. Captain Callan Thorne of Earth's 3rd Reconnaissance, Ibomo, step forward and choose the flame that shall bind our worlds. Sarah didn't look up. She'd perfected the art of not watching, not hoping. Better to stare at the floor and wait for the ceremony to move past her. Wait for one of the perfect princesses to be chosen while she stood forgotten at the end of the line, a reminder of what happened when Vorshai discipline failed. Footsteps clicked across obsidian. Sharp, rhythmic, the sound of military boots that had walked through worse places than gilded halls. Sarah heard the human captain pass the first princess, then the second. The whispers in the crowd shifted, confused murmuring replacing polite disinterest. He walked past the third princess, the fourth, the fifth. Sarah's pulse hammered against her ribs. Through her thermal vision, she tracked his heat signature moving down the line. Past Princess Vera, with her scholar's grace and 3 doctoral dissertations. Past Princess Kael, with her diplomat's smile and the trade agreements she'd personally negotiated. Past every logical choice, every strategic alliance, every princess who represented actual value to Earth's interests. The footsteps stopped, directly in front of her. Sarah looked up. The human was tall for his species, just over 6 feet, with shoulders that spoke of years carrying heavy gear through hostile terrain. His dress uniform was crisp and formal dark blue fabric stretched across a frame that was all lean muscle and old scars. But it was his face that made Sarah's breath catch. Not handsome in any conventional sense. Too many lines, too much damage. A jaw that looked like it had been broken and badly set at least twice. A nose that had been shattered, healed, crooked, probably shattered again. And eyes the color of winter ice, pale blue, and utterly relentless. The eyes of someone who had seen the worst humanity and the universe had to offer and had kept walking anyway. He was staring at her scar. Sarah waited for the disgust, the polite excuse, the careful step backward that would let him choose someone else, someone whose face didn't advertise her fundamental brokenness to the entire hall. Instead, Captain Callan Thorne reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made the entire hall fall silent. An obsidian blade fragment, jagged, sharp enough to draw blood at a glance. The edge still unnaturally keen despite a decade of wear, the crystalline structure catching the light and throwing it back in sharp angles. Sarah's heart stopped. She knew that fragment, knew the precise angle of the break, the way the light caught the microscopic fracture lines in the crystal. It was a piece of her mother's blade, the weapon she had snapped in a cave 10 years ago, giving 35 condemned soldiers a chance at life. "I'm a soldier, warlord," Callan said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. He wasn't looking at Draven on his throne. He was looking at Sarah. "I don't need a diplomat to tell me when the wind's changing. I need someone who can hold the line when it matters." He stepped closer. Close enough that Sarah could smell the starch in his uniform and the faint scent of gun oil that no amount of ceremony could wash away. Close enough that she could see the network of scars on his knuckles, the way his hands stayed steady despite the weight of 1,000 stares. Close enough that she could count the silver threads in his dark hair, the laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he hadn't always been this hard. Callan held up the obsidian fragment between them. Then he pointed it at her. Her. The word hit the hall like a detonation. A hegemony countess dropped her glass, the crystal shattering on obsidian with a sound like a gunshot. Vorshai generals leaned forward, his expressions caught between outrage and disbelief. The human delegates stared at their captain like he'd just volunteered for a firing squad. Some were already calculating, wondering what leverage Earth Command had promised him to make this sacrifice. Others looked genuinely shocked, mouths hanging open in naked confusion. And Sarah, who had spent 10 years believing she would never be chosen for anything except exile, couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what was happening. He knows her mind screamed. He was one of the 35. He knows what I did, and he's choosing me anyway. But why leverage revenge disguised as gratitude? Some elaborate political game she was too stupid to see coming. Was this Earth Command's way of humiliating the warlord by forcing his disgraced daughter into a position of importance she didn't deserve? Draven rose from his throne, the movement slow and deliberate. The warlord of the thermal territories stood nearly 8 feet tall in his ceremonial armor, a mountain of gold-plated bone and ancient fury. His voice, when he spoke, made the air vibrate. The human chooses the broken blade. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. You seek a union with a warrior who knows only the language of failure, Captain. There are diplomats among us. There are scholars. Women who could bring you star systems and dowry alliances that would make Earth a true power in the convergence. Callan didn't flinch. He kept his gaze locked on Sarah, and through some trick of the light or some madness in his expression, she saw something she hadn't seen in 10 years. Recognition, not of her failure, of something else. "With respect, warlord," Callan said, his voice steady as stone, "I've seen what your diplomats call success. I've walked through the ashes of it. I need someone who understands that some choices cost everything and are still worth making. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her. Not at the scar, not at the broken, discarded daughter standing at the end of the line. At her. "Do you accept?" he asked quietly. Sarah's mouth was dry. Her mind raced through 100 possibilities, 100 traps she might be walking into. But beneath the fear and confusion, something else stirred. A memory of standing in a cave holding a broken blade watching 35 men run toward freedom while she waited for her father's judgment. Some choices cost everything and are still worth making. "I accept," Sarah heard herself say. The words felt like stepping off a cliff. Callan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened, just for a second. Then he reached out and Sarah felt his hand close around hers. His skin was shockingly cool compared to her natural heat, rough with calluses, that spoke of a life spent holding weapons, climbing ropes, surviving in places that wanted him dead. "The bloodlock is accepted," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. She turned toward the throne, raising their joined hands high. The traditional words of the bonding ceremony fell from her lips like stones, the ritual phrases she'd memorized as a child. "Let the bridge be forged. Let the fire and ice unite." Draven's expression was unreadable, but the way his armored fingers gripped the throne's arms, knuckles white beneath the metal, told Sarah everything she needed to know. Her father was furious. Good. The thermal crystals in the chandeliers flared to blinding intensity. Hegemony physicians stepped forward carrying the Cortex bridge apparatus on cushions of woven thermal fiber. Neural styluses that gleamed like surgical instruments. Thermal regulators to prevent the human from being burned alive by Vorshai body heat. Technology that would bind Sarah and Callan together at the level of their nervous systems, creating a permanent link that couldn't be severed without killing them both. The ritual energy began to coil around their joined wrists. White-hot chains of light that sizzled against skin and scale alike. It felt like being branded with starfire, a sharp, white-hot agony that made Sarah's vision swim and her legs buckle. She heard Callan make a sound between his teeth, felt his grip on her hand tighten until bones ground together. Through the forming bond, she felt the first flickers of his pain. Different from hers. Where her nerves screamed from heat, they were designed to withstand his screamed from heat that should be killing him. The pain peaked. The world went white, and then it was over. Sarah gasped, stumbling. Callan caught her elbow, steadying her with a grip that was gentle despite his obvious disorientation. She looked down at her wrist and saw the mark. A dark, pulsing sigil etched into her skin, glowing faintly with an inner light that shifted between crimson and pale blue. She didn't need to look at Callan's wrist to know he wore an identical mark. They were bonded, linked, chained together by neural fire and treaty law. And standing in the grand hall surrounded by 1,000 hostile stares, Sarah realized she had just become the most dangerous thing in the thermal territories. A defective blade that someone had chosen to wield anyway. The ceremonial suite was a circular chamber of carved basalt 3 levels below the grand hall, far from the prying eyes of delegates and the weight of her father's disapproval. The floor radiated heat from the lava tubes that ran beneath the citadel, warm enough to make a human sweat but comfortable for Vorshai physiology. Thermal vents in the walls released controlled bursts of steam, keeping the air breathable, but heavy with moisture, and the smell of hot stone and minerals from deep in the earth. Sarah stood by the window staring out at the twin heat shimmer rising from the Nevada desert. The stars were invisible through the thermal distortion, replaced by dancing columns of superheated air that made the night sky look like it was breathing. Her armor felt too tight. Her skin felt too hot. The mark on her wrist pulsed with a rhythm that wasn't quite her heartbeat, a foreign sensation that made her acutely aware of the human standing 10 feet behind her. Callan had stripped off his dress jacket, revealing a simple undershirt damp with sweat. His body was a roadmap of old violence. Scars crisscrossed his shoulders and arms, some neat surgical lines, others jagged tears that spoke of shrapnel and close calls and medical care received in the field rather than a proper hospital. He moved like someone who expected the floor to explode beneath him at any moment, weight balanced on the balls of his feet, eyes constantly tracking exits and potential threats. A soldier, not a politician, not a spy, just a man who had survived too many things that should have killed him. "The meal is prepared," Sarah said, her voice flat. She gestured to the low table in the center of the room where the bloodlock ritual feast had been laid out. 2 cups of fermented igneous sap, thick and dark as oil, releasing faint wisp of vapor. A platter of nutrient-dense marrow raw and glistening, the traditional Vorshai food for strengthening bonds. We need to stabilize the bond. If we don't share essence within the first 6 hours, the neural feedback will tear our nervous systems apart. Callan turned his pale eyes studying her face. So this is biology, not romance. This is survival, Sarah corrected. Nothing more. She sat cross-legged on the heated floor, the movement stiff and formal. Callan lowered himself opposite her, joints popping audibly. The sound was startlingly human, a reminder of how fragile he was compared to her species. He reached for one of the cups, but Sarah caught his wrist before his fingers made contact. The moment they touched, something shifted. A faint hum at the base of her skull, a pressure behind her eyes that tasted like ozone and cold wind. The cortex bridge activating, sensing, beginning to map the neural pathways between them, building highways of shared sensation that would link them for the rest of their lives. Why me? Sarah asked. The question came out harder than she intended. There were women in that hall who could have brought you entire colonies in alliance. Women who wouldn't have spent the first 5 minutes wondering if you chose me to humiliate me. Callan looked at her hand on his wrist. His pulse beat steady and slow beneath her fingers, a rhythm that spoke of controlled fear rather than calm. She could feel it now through the bridge, the adrenaline in his system, the deliberate breathing exercises he was using to keep his heart rate down. The others looked at me and saw a map of Earth's resources, trade routes, strategic value. He met her eyes. You looked at me like you were trying to figure out where my armor was weakest. And that appealed to you. In my experience, Callan said quietly, the person who wants to know how to kill you is the only one being honest. In a place like this, honesty is a luxury I can't afford to pass up. Sarah felt something ripple through the cortex bridge. Not words, not thoughts. Just a flicker of emotion that tasted like recognition, an old grief, and the particular exhaustion that comes from pretending to be fine for too long. She pulled her hand back, pulse hammering. You have a reputation, Captain Thorne, she said, reaching for the marrow platter to give her hand something to do. The ghost of Cinder Ridge. They say you survived the siege by walking through a minefield just to spite the enemy. Callan's expression went cold and flat. The humor drained from his eyes, replaced by something that looked like old stone worn smooth by years of erosion. Don't believe everything you hear in the mess halls. I didn't walk through that field despite anyone. I did it because my squad was pinned down and I was the only one small enough to fit through the gaps. He leaned forward, voice dropping an octave. Most of them didn't make it anyway. Sniper got Richards before we made it 50 meters. IED took out Torres and Mills. By the time we reached the extraction point, I was carrying Sergeant Chen's dog tags and trying to remember how to stop shaking. Sarah studied him, the way he held himself, the careful control in every movement. She'd seen that kind of control before in warriors who carried their dead like weights strapped to their backs. Loss is heavy armor, she said, repeating an old Vorshai proverb. Yeah, well, Callan's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. It's the only kind I've got that fits. Silence settled between them, broken only by the hiss of thermal vents and the distant rumble of machinery deep in the Citadel's core. Sarah took a piece of marrow, bit into it. The rich metallic taste grounded her, gave her something to focus on besides the man sitting across from her and the mark burning on her wrist. We need to test the bridge, she said finally. The cortex link won't stabilize unless we initiate a full neural sync. It's going to hurt. You're going to see things from my mind that I would rather keep buried. And if you can't handle the weight of a Vorshai's memories, you should walk away now. I'll tell the Hegemony Council you died in your sleep. It would be kinder than what's coming. Callan stood up, his face set in an expression Sarah was starting to recognize. Stubborn, reckless. The look of a man who had already decided which hill he was willing to die on. I've had my brain scrambled by worse things than an alien warrior princess, he said. Plug me in. Sarah rose, drawing a small obsidian stylus from her belt. The device was ancient pre-landing technology that the Vorshai had carried across the stars. Neural interface tech that bypassed language and went straight to the raw data of memory and sensation. She stepped closer to Callan, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her own skin reflected back by his. close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. Not from aggression, from fear he was trying to hide. "This is your last chance," Sarah said softly. "Just do it." She pressed the stylus against the mark on his wrist. Simultaneously, she touched it to her own mark. The world didn't fade. It detonated. Sarah gasped as a tidal wave of ice and memory crashed into her mind. She wasn't in the suite anymore. She was standing on frozen ground beneath a sky the color of bruises, surrounded by the smell of blood and burning fuel and the particular chemical stench of explosives. She felt the roar of a battle not her own, the crushing weight of a culture built on survival and loss. She felt Callan's loneliness, the cold, sharp ache of a man who had watched everyone he cared about die and kept walking anyway because stopping meant admitting it mattered. And beneath it all, she felt his fear. Not the hot, explosive fear of combat, the deep, grinding terror of someone who had spent 30 years trying to be brave enough, strong enough, good enough, and never quite believing he was any of those things. Every time he'd led a squad into danger. Every time he'd made a call that got someone killed. Every time he'd stood at a memorial service and listened to names being read while wondering if his decisions had been the right ones. He wasn't fearless. He was just better at moving while terrified than anyone she had ever met. But Callan was drowning in her memories too. She felt him stagger under the weight of 28 years of fire and shame. The endless Vorshai training grounds where weakness meant death and hesitation meant punishment. The cold disappointment in her father's eyes every time she hesitated, every time she showed mercy, when doctrine demanded ruthlessness. The night she broke her mother's blade and felt something inside herself break with it. The 10 years of exile that followed training alone in abandoned outposts, becoming the warrior no one wanted. He felt her loneliness. The decades of being the defective one, the mistake everyone wished would quietly disappear. The crushing certainty that she deserved every moment of isolation because she had failed to be what her people needed her to be. The connection snapped. Sarah stumbled back, hitting the wall hard enough to crack stone. Her chest heaved like she'd just run 10 miles. Blood trickled from her nose, hot copper against her lips. Across the room, Callan had dropped to one knee, his eyes wide and glassy breath coming in ragged gasps. "You," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "You carry the ghosts of an entire squad." "And you," Callan rasped, wiping blood from his own nose with the back of his hand. "You're not the monster they say you are. You're just tired, tired of burning everything you touch." They stared at each other across the heated chamber. The air between them felt charged electric with something Sarah didn't have words for. They weren't strangers anymore. Couldn't be. The Cortex Bridge had stripped away every wall, every careful lie they told themselves. They were two broken things trying to fit their jagged edges together, and somehow, impossibly, it was working. Callan pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. He looked at Sarah with an expression she had never seen directed at her before. Not pity, not disgust, understanding. "That cave," he said quietly. 10 years ago, that was you." It wasn't a question. He'd felt the memory through the bridge, felt her standing at the entrance with her broken blade, making the choice that had cost her everything. "I was one of the 35, Callan continued, third row back left corner. I watched you snap that weapon, and I spent 10 years trying to figure out why the fiercest warrior in the thermal territories showed mercy when the whole world told her to be a monster." Sarah's throat closed. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe past the sudden pressure in her chest. "I didn't choose you for leverage," Callan said, crossing the distance between them in 3 strides. "I didn't choose you for some political game. I chose you because I've spent a decade wondering if there was anyone else in this whole damn galaxy who understood that some things are worth more than survival." He pulled the obsidian fragment from his pocket, the piece of her mother's blade he'd carried for 10 years, held it out between them like an offering. "You gave me my life back, and when you had every reason to take it. I'm just trying to return the favor." Sarah looked at the fragment, at the broken piece of a weapon that should have killed him. Slowly, she reached out her fingers, brushing against his. A jolt of pure, unfiltered emotion surged through the Cortex Bridge. Relief, fear, a dawning, fragile hope that tasted like sunrise after a decade of night. "My father gave me this scar because I failed to deliver 35 heads to his throne," Sarah whispered. He called it my badge of cowardice. Callan's fingers closed around hers, the fragment caught between their palms. From where I'm standing, he said, his voice rough with something that sounded like reverence. It looks like a badge of courage. Before Sarah could respond, before she could process the weight of what he'd just said, a sharp alarm cut through the silence of the suite. The kind of alarm that meant shields were failing and death was at the door. The chamber doors hissed open. A human aide stumbled in, his face pale with terror, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. His uniform was torn, smoke rising from a burn on his shoulder. "Captain, Princess." The man's voice cracked. "Perimeter sensors just went dark. Something's coming through the thermal vents. It's not Vorshai rebels. It's not human insurgents. It's shadow eaters." Sarah finished, her blood turning to ice. The void had found them on their wedding night, and standing in a ceremonial suite with no weapons and no backup, Sarah realized that the easy part, the part where they survived the ceremony, was over. The real war was just beginning. The sound of shadow eaters was not a scream. It was a low-frequency hum that vibrated in the fillings of teeth and made the fluid in the inner ear feel like it was curdling. It was the sound of reality being chewed up by something that didn't belong in this dimension, a frequency that existed somewhere between noise and silence, and made human and Vorshai nervous systems respond with identical primal terror. Sarah's combat instincts took over before conscious thought could catch up. She lunged for the ceremonial glaive mounted on the wall, her fingers closing around the obsidian haft with the muscle memory of 28 years of training. The weapon ignited in her hands, orange thermal energy crackling along the blade's edge like trapped lightning. "Stay behind me," she commanded, spinning to face the doorway where the aide had collapsed. "Shadow eaters don't bleed, they consume. If one touches you—" "Not happening," Callan interrupted. He'd grabbed a heavy basalt mace from a display stand, the decorative weapon suddenly looking very functional in his scarred hands. 20 kilograms of solid volcanic rock, and he swung it with the practiced ease of someone who'd trained with improvised weapons. "I didn't survive 10 years just to hide behind my wife on our wedding night." The word wife sent a strange jolt through the cortex bridge. Sarah felt it echo in her chest, warm and unexpected, and utterly wrong for this moment when death was crawling through the vents toward them. "You're human," she hissed, moving toward the door Anitram in a combat crouch. "Your nervous system can't handle prolonged exposure to void matter. You'll hemorrhage from the inside out." "Then I'll make it quick." Through the bridge, Sarah felt his fear. It was a cold spike of adrenaline, sharp as broken glass. But beneath it was something harder. Determination. The same stubborn refusal to break that had carried him through a minefield while his squad died around him. She wanted to argue, wanted to order him to safety. But the shadows were already bleeding through the doorway, and there was no time for anything except survival. The first shadow eater came through the entrance like smoke given predatory intent. It had no eyes, no mouth, just a shifting, oily silhouette that drained the light from the air around it. The temperature in the suite dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. Frost began forming on the basalt floor, an impossibility in a room heated by lava tubes running 50 feet below. Sarah didn't hesitate. She lunged her glaive, carving through the creature's center mass. White-hot thermal energy met void matter in a detonation that lit the chamber like a supernova. The shadow eater dissipated into foul-smelling gray ash, but 3 more were already crawling through the vents, their forms twitching with that unnatural stop-motion movement that defied physics. "They're attracted to heat," Sarah shouted over the rising hum. "The Citadel's thermal core is drawing them like a beacon. We need to reach the emergency docks before—" A shadow tendril lashed out from her blind spot. Sarah felt the warning through the cortex bridge a split second before it would have taken her head off. She twisted, but the movement left her off balance. The tendril wrapped around her ankle, and the cold was immediate and absolute, like having her leg plunged into liquid nitrogen. Her armor cracked. Her skin blistered. Through the neural link, she felt Callan's sympathetic pain. Spike felt him stagger as her agony became his. Then the basalt mace came down like the hammer of an angry god. Callan's swing shattered the tendril, disrupted its form long enough for Sarah to wrench free. She rolled to her feet, glaive already spinning in a defensive arc. "Together," Callan said, falling into position at her back. "We move together." And they did. For someone who had spent 28 years fighting alone, the sensation of having a partner was disorienting. Every time a shadow tried to flank Sarah, she felt Callan's warning through the bridge, his awareness feeding into hers like a second set of eyes. Every time he overextended a strike, she was there to cover his retreat, her glaive creating a barrier of fire that the void creatures couldn't cross. They fought their way out of the suite and into the chaos of the Citadel's lower levels. Vorshai warriors ran past them, some screaming orders in their harsh native tongue, others just screaming. Humans in tactical gear fired pulse weapons that did nothing against enemies made of animated darkness. The emergency lights flickered and died, plunging whole sections into blackness that writhed with hostile intent. Maintenance access, Sarah gasped, pointing to a narrow corridor half hidden behind a collapsed support beam. 7 levels down. There's a prototype ship in the auxiliary hangar. If we can reach it before the main core ruptures. The sentence died as the floor beneath them buckled. A massive shadow herald erupted from the fractured stone easily, 4 meters tall, its body draped in what looked like tattered ribbons of space itself. Where its face should have been, there was only a swirling vortex of white noise and cosmic static. Sarah had fought shadow eaters before, small ones, scouts. This was something different, something ancient and vast and utterly hostile to the concept of life. The herald didn't attack. It simply expanded, a wave of absolute nothingness rolling toward them like a tsunami made of antimatter. Through the cortex bridge, Sarah felt Callan's biological panic. His human heart wasn't meant to beat in proximity to this kind of wrongness. His cells were starting to shut down one by one as the void presence disrupted the electrical patterns that kept him alive. He was dying, and because of the neural link, she was dying with him. "Run," Sarah commanded, shoving him toward the maintenance corridor. "I'll hold it. You get to the ship. If one of us survives, the treaty holds. If we both die here." Callan grabbed her armored collar and hauled her bodily toward the corridor entrance. For a human, he was shockingly strong. "We move together." Sarah triggered the thermal release on her glaive. The weapon had a fail-safe, a one-shot overload that would turn it into a miniature star for approximately 3 seconds. It would buy them maybe 10 seconds of escape time. It would also destroy a weapon that had taken Vorshai master crafters 3 years to forge. She didn't hesitate. The glaive detonated. The herald shrieked a psychic wail that made Sarah's ears bleed and her vision fracture into kaleidoscope fragments. The corridor shook. Support pillars cracked. Somewhere above them, she heard the groan of 1,000 tons of obsidian beginning to collapse. They ran. The maintenance flumes were a vertical nightmare of heat and steam and metal edges sharp enough to fillet skin. Sarah led the way, her thermal vision cutting through the darkness, finding handholds and ledges that would support their weight. Behind her, she felt Callan's presence through the bridge, his lungs burning from the superheated air, his ribs screaming where the herald's proximity had cracked bone, his hands bleeding from a dozen cuts, but still gripping, still climbing, still refusing to fall. They emerged in the auxiliary hangar 7 minutes later. 7 minutes that felt like 7 hours. The docking bay was mostly empty, the larger ships already launched in a desperate scramble to defend the Citadel's airspace. Only a few maintenance shuttles remained, and at the far end of the bay, one sleek prototype that Sarah had helped test 3 years ago. The Cinder Runner, fast, temperamental, and absolutely their only chance. "Get to the ship," Sarah ordered, already moving. "I'll prime the reactor." They stumbled across the open deck armor, clattering breath-ragged. Sarah's hands flew across the ship's external controls, bypassing 3 security locks and a biometric scanner that didn't recognize her anymore because she'd been stripped of her military clearance years ago. The reactor hummed to life, a deep bass vibration that rattled her bones and made the mark on her wrist pulse in sympathetic resonance. They were 10 meters from the loading ramp when Draven's voice echoed across the hangar. "Sarah, stop." She froze. Not from obedience, from pure instinctive conditioning. 28 years of that voice meant 28 years of immediate compliance or punishment. Her father stood at the hangar's main entrance, flanked by a dozen high guards in full combat armor. He wasn't wearing his ceremonial regalia anymore. This was the warlord of the thermal territories in battle array, obsidian plate heated to white incandescence thermal projector weapons that could melt through starship hulls. "Step away from the human," Draven said. His voice was calm, reasonable, the voice he used when giving orders he expected to be followed without question. The Shadow Eater incursion is contained. Return to your quarters. We will discuss your choice after the crisis has passed. Sarah's hand tightened on her glaive haft. She didn't have a weapon anymore, just a burned-out shell of obsidian in fading heat, useless against her father's guard. Through the Cortex bridge, she felt Callan's anger. Not at Draven, at the situation, at the unfairness of surviving hell only to be stopped by politics and patriarchal authority. No, Sarah said. The word fell into the hangar like a stone into still water. Ripples of shock spread through the assembled guards. No one said no to Draven, not High Reavers, not planetary governors, certainly not disgraced daughters. What did you say? Her father's voice was still calm, but now there was something underneath it, a grinding tectonic pressure. Sarah stepped forward, placing herself between Callan and the guards. I said no, father. I'm not returning to quarters. I'm not discussing my choice. I'm leaving. With my husband. And if you want to stop me, you're going to have to kill me. The hangar was silent except for the distant rumble of explosions and the Cinder Runner's idling reactor. Draven stared at his daughter, the scar he had given her, the defiance he had spent 10 years trying to burn out of her. So be it, he said. The guards raised their weapons, and Sarah, who had spent a decade believing she was broken, felt something inside her chest ignite. Not fear, not shame, fury. She grabbed Callan's hand and together they dove for the Cinder Runner's ramp as thermal fire turned the air behind them into plasma. They escaped the Citadel with the ship's hull at 40% integrity and both of them bleeding from a dozen minor wounds. Sarah piloted with her teeth gritted, pushing the reactor past safe limits, feeling the Cinder Runner shudder in protest under her hands. Through the viewport, she watched the Nevada Citadel shrink behind them. Obsidian towers burning with internal fire, Shadow Eaters swarming like locusts against the defensive perimeter. Her home, the only place she'd ever known, dying behind her while she ran. Where are we going? Callan asked from the co-pilot seat. He'd strapped himself in with shaking hands, his face gray with pain and blood loss. Sarah pulled up the nav display. The thermal territory spread out before her in infrared relief. Colonies, outposts, the ragged border where Vorshai and human settlements met in uneasy proximity. And there, highlighted in warning red, was New Phoenix, an Arizona mining colony at the edge of the territory's population, 50,000 mix of human laborers and Vorshai heat harvesters. According to the emergency broadcasts flooding all frequencies, it was under siege by Shadow Eaters. According to the same broadcast, 3 Hegemony Council cruisers had just entered high orbit above the colony. Their ventral cannons were charging. No, Sarah whispered. Callan leaned forward, squinting at the tactical display. His combat experience let him read the pattern even before the official transmission came through. That's a purge strike formation, he said flatly. They're going to glass the whole colony to cauterize the Shadow Eater infection. 50,000 people, Sarah said. Her hands were shaking on the controls. Civilians, families, children who never asked to be part of this war. The transmission crackled to life, cold, official, the voice of hegemony protocol overriding human compassion. Attention all vessels. New Phoenix Colony has been declared a Level 5 contamination zone. Purge protocols are now in effect. All ships are ordered to clear orbital space within 30 minutes. Any vessel remaining in the strike zone will be considered hostile and destroyed. 30 minutes. Half an hour before the cruisers turned 50,000 lives into radioactive glass. Sarah stared at the countdown timer. At the colony marker pulsing on her screen like a dying heartbeat. She thought about the people down there. Thought about them huddling in shelters praying for rescue that wasn't coming. Thought about children crying while their parents lied and said everything would be okay. She thought about 35 soldiers in a cave waiting to die. Through the Cortex bridge, she felt Callan watching her. Felt his understanding. He knew what she was thinking, knew the choice she was about to make. If we go down there, she said quietly, if we interfere with a hegemony purge strike, we're not just rebels anymore. We're enemies of the convergence. My father will have no choice but to mark us for termination. There will be no more politics, no more negotiations, just a hunt. I know. Every ship in 3 sectors will have our names. Every bounty hunter, every mercenary, every opportunist looking for an easy payday. The entire empire will want us dead. I know. Sarah looked at him. At this human who had chosen her when he had every reason not to, who had stood with her against Shadow Heralds and her father's fury, who was looking at her now with absolute certainty in those winter blue eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you willing to throw everything away for strangers?" Callan reached across the console and took her hand. The cortex bridge flared, and she felt his answer before he spoke it. "Because 10 years ago you showed me that one person's choice can save 35 lives. And if we don't make that choice now for 50,000 people, then what was the point of surviving the last decade? What was the point of you breaking that blade?" Sarah felt tears burn her eyes, copper-scented liquid that tracked down her scarred cheek. She'd spent 10 years believing her mercy was her weakness, her defect, the thing that made her broken. But Callan was right. She'd saved 35 lives and lost everything. And she'd do it again. Would make that choice every time, even knowing the cost. 15 minutes to New Phoenix, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "If we're going to be traitors, Callan, let's at least be the best damn traitors this galaxy has ever seen." She banked the Cinder Runner hard, the ship's hull screaming in protest as they dove toward the Arizona colony burning beneath them. Behind them, unnoticed in the chaos, Draven's flagship began to move. The hunt had begun. New Phoenix looked like hell's anteroom. The mining colony sprawled across a basin of red rock and dust prefab structures, mixed with Vorshai thermal habs, all of it connected by a web of industrial piping and power conduits. Under normal circumstances, it was ugly but functional. A place where humans and Vorshai worked side by side, not because they liked each other, but because the lithium deposits didn't care about species politics. Now it was a war zone. Shadow Eaters swarmed through the streets in writhing masses. The mining spires leaned at impossible angles, their support structures corrupted by void matter. Fires burned with that strange cold light that marked dimensional contamination. And above it all, the three hegemony cruisers hung like executioners, their weapons charging with a pale blue glow that promised oblivion. "The relay station is on that ridge," Callan said, pointing to a jagged outcropping overlooking the main settlement. "If we can land on the roof, bypass the encryption, and get a distress signal to the U.S. Legion garrison at Fort Mojave, they'll have maybe 10 minutes to scramble a response before the hegemony fires anyway," Sarah finished. "But it's a chance, better than these people have right now." She brought the Cinder Runner down in what could generously be called a controlled crash. They hit the relay station's reinforced roof with enough force to deploy the emergency struts and crack half the landing gear. The airlock hissed open and the Arizona desert air rushed in, hot and dry and tasting of ozone and ash. Sarah grabbed her backup weapon, a short thermal blade she'd kept in the ship's emergency locker. Callan checked the pulse carbine he'd scavenged from a dead guard during their escape. Not ideal loadouts, but better than bare hands. 5 minutes, Sarah said, checking her chronometer. "I need 5 minutes to hack the terminal and broadcast the SOS. Can you hold the entrance?" "Make it 4, Callan replied, already moving to cover the roof access hatch. "I've got a bad feeling about—" The hatch exploded upward in a shower of twisted metal. A cluster of Shadow Eaters erupted from below, their forms pulsing with that sickly, rhythmic light that meant they were feeding on the relay station's power core, draining it to fuel their passage between dimensions. Callan opened fire. Pulse rounds tore into void matter, dispersing some and raging others. The creatures shrieked, that psychic wail that made blood vessels burst and thoughts fragment. Sarah ran for the terminal room. She had 4 minutes to save 50,000 lives. She was going to need every second. The main console was a disaster. Smashed screens, severed cables, a thick, oily film covering every surface where Shadow Eaters had fed. But the core systems were still active, still broadcasting on low-power emergency bands. Sarah's fingers flew across the haptic interface. She'd learned human coding during her exile, studying forbidden texts in abandoned outposts where no one cared what the defective princess did with her time. Now that knowledge meant the difference between life and death. Bypass encryption, rewrote power from life support, boost the signal to maximum. Outside, she heard Callan's carbine firing in controlled bursts, heard his breathing spike through the cortex bridge as pain lanced through his shoulder. A shadow tendril had tagged him. Not deep, but bleeding. 3 minutes left. Sarah's hands shook as she coded the final command sequence. She could do this. She could. A Shadowlian punched through the wall beside her head, missing her by centimeters. More were coming. The room was filling with void matter, the temperature dropping so fast her breath crystallized in the air. 2 minutes. Through the bridge, she felt Callan's desperation. He was holding the line, but barely. His ammunition was running low. His body was failing. He was buying her time with his life. Sarah stared at the console, at the blinking green icon that meant the uplink was established, at the transmission buffer waiting for her message. She grabbed the audio pickup and spoke. "This is Princess Sarah of the Vorshai bloodline. New Phoenix is under Shadow Eater attack. Hegemony forces are preparing an illegal purge strike on civilian population. We need immediate assistance. Repeat, we need assistance now. The colony is not lost. We are still breathing." She hit send as a shadow limb smashed into the console, showering her with sparks and molten plastic. The screen went dark, but the data burst was already gone, screaming across every Terran and Vorshai frequency and range. "Callan!" Sarah shouted, running for the roof. "We're out of time!" She found him standing in a circle of gray ash, his carbine empty, his face pale and drawn. He'd held them. Against impossible odds, he'd held them long enough. Together they ran for the Cinder Runner as the sky above New Phoenix turned brilliant, terrifying white. The hegemony cruisers were firing. But then something impossible happened. A massive silver hull dropped out of warp directly between the cruisers and the planet, the Vanguard flagship of Earth's 7th Legion. And right behind it, 3 Vorshai war galleys from the Splinter clans were decloaking their weapons hot and their intent clear. The Splinter clans, Vorshai factions that had broken from Draven's iron rule years ago, seeking autonomy in the fringe territories. Sarah had heard whispers of them at the ceremony emissaries who'd been negotiating with human colonies in secret. Now they were here, choosing this moment to make their allegiance known. They'd listened. Someone had actually listened. Sarah leaned against the ship's hull, her legs shaking with exhaustion and relief. Through the Cortex bridge, she felt Callan's matching emotion. They'd done it. Saved 50,000 people with nothing but a jury-rigged transmission and sheer bloody-minded stubbornness. But as the Cinder Runner lifted off, as they watched the orbital battle unfold above the burning colony, Sarah felt the first cold weight of what they'd just done. They had defied the Hegemony Council, interfered with purge protocols, made themselves enemies of the established order. And her father would never forgive that. "Incoming transmission," Callan said, his voice tight. "It's from the Obsidian Throne, your father's flagship. He's demanding we surrender and return to the Citadel for trial." Sarah looked at the mark on her wrist, at the bond that tied her to this human, this impossible man who had chosen to stand with her against the entire weight of galactic authority. "Tell him," she said quietly, "that we're not coming home." The response came 3 hours later, broadcast across every frequency, impossible to ignore. "By order of Warlord Draven and the Hegemony High Council, Princess Sarah and Captain Callan Thorne are hereby declared enemies of the Convergence. The charge treason against the established order. The sentence termination on sight. A bounty of 100 million credits is offered for their capture, dead or alive. All Vorshai military units, all Hegemony security forces, and all registered bounty contractors are authorized to engage." Callan whistled low. 100 million. I've never been worth that much before. "It's not just military anymore," Sarah said, staring at the bounty notice, replicating across the nav display. "Civilian hunters, mercenaries, opportunists. Every ship in 3 sectors is going to be looking for us." "Where do we go?" Sarah pulled up the long-range scan. There at the edge of the mapped territories was a region marked in warning red, the Death Valley Rift Zone, where the dimensional tear between realities was widest, where Shadow Eaters were spawning in greater and greater numbers, where, according to fragments of classified data she'd stolen years ago, something else was hidden, something her father didn't want anyone to find. "There," she said, setting course. "If we're going to save this galaxy, Callan, we need to go where it's already dying. We need to see what my father has been hiding in the dark." "We need to stop first," Callan said, pulling up a different screen. "Damaged ship with a galaxy-wide bounty won't last 3 days. There's an abandoned mining station at grid reference 77 Delta. Used to be a Splinter Clan outpost before they relocated. We can patch the hull, maybe scavenge some supplies." Sarah studied the coordinates. It would add 6 hours to their journey, but he was right. They wouldn't make it to Death Valley in a ship held together by prayers and emergency sealant. "Set course," she said. The mining station was a ghost town, but its automated repair bays still functioned. Sarah nursed the cinder runner through emergency repairs, patching hull breaches with salvaged plating, while Callan stood watch pulse carbine, trained on the darkness beyond the hangar entrance. It took them 8 hours instead of 6 working in shifts, stealing moments of rest when exhaustion made their hands shake too badly to weld. When they finally lifted off, the ship was at 70% integrity. Not perfect, but enough to run. The Cinder Runner's reactor hummed to life, and they vanished into the deep desert, two fugitives against an empire racing toward the answers buried in the place where reality itself was coming apart. Behind them, Draven stood on the bridge of the Obsidian Throne and watched his daughter run. "Ready the neural inhibitor," he said to the technicians. "When we catch them, I want that bond severed. Permanently." He would get his daughter back. Even if he had to kill the human and burn the mercy out of her one more time. The hunt was just beginning, and Draven had never lost a hunt in his life. The Death Valley Rift looked like the place where God had given up on creation. Sarah piloted the Cinder Runner through a graveyard of ships, thousands of hulks drifting in slow spirals around a central point of absolute darkness. Ancient Vorshai dreadnoughts, their bone-plated hulls bleached white by cosmic radiation. Hegemony vessels torn in half, their crews long dead. Human colony ships that had vanished decades ago, now floating tombstones marking the edge of mapped space. All of them were being pulled toward the darkness at the center. Not by gravity, by something worse. "Navigation is completely fried," Killen said from the co-pilot seat. His face was drawn, exhausted from 3 days of running. 3 days of dodging hunter ships and evading pursuit. Gravitational constants are fluctuating 40% every 10 seconds. "This whole sector is broken, Sarah." She knew, could feel it through her thermal senses, the way reality itself was becoming thin here. Like cloth worn so threadbare you could see through to the nothing beneath. "My people's legends called this the Grave of Suns," Sarah said quietly. "The first Vorshai colonists believed it was a natural phenomenon, a dimensional weak point where the barrier between our reality and the void had always been fragile." "But," Callan prompted, "but I found classified archives during my exile, reports my father had sealed under maximum security." "This isn't natural, Callan. Someone built this. Or more accurately, someone is maintaining it." She brought up the long-range scan, enhancing the image of the structure at the center of the ship graveyard. It was massive, kilometers long, shaped like a jagged needle made of obsidian and something else. Something that hurt to look at directly, as if the material itself rejected the concept of light. "The rift pylon. That's what's generating the dimensional tear," Sarah continued. Her voice was steady, but through the cortex bridge, Callan could feel her fear. Deep, ancient. The terror of understanding something that shouldn't exist. "It's a precursor weapon, built by the first Vorshai who came to Earth before the landing, before the treaties. A fail-safe in case the conquest failed." Callan leaned forward, studying the pylon's structure. A fail-safe for what? Sarah's hands tightened on the controls until her knuckles went white beneath her crimson skin. A reset button. If the Vorshai Empire ever loses control of Earth, if human resistance ever becomes too strong, if the balance of power shifts too far away from my people's dominance, the pylon activates. It tears open the rift, completely floods the entire region with shadow eaters, and scours everything clean. Humans, Vorshai, every living thing within 1,000 miles. She pulled up the energy readings. The pylon's output had been steadily increasing for months. Right around the time the Hegemony Council had started pushing for the Union treaties. Right around the time political tensions had reached a breaking point. "My father is preparing to activate it," Sarah whispered. "If he can't control the future, he'd rather erase it and start over. Even if it means killing millions of his own people." Through the bridge, she felt Callan's rage, cold and focused as a blade. "Then we destroy it. The pylon is protected by multi-phase shields. We can't shoot our way through. But the cortex bridge, the neural resonance between us, it matches the frequency of precursor technology. If we can reach the primary emitter at the pylon's core, we can use the bond to overload the system." "What's the survival rate for that kind of feedback?" Sarah met his eyes. "Less than 5%. The neural energy required would burn through a human nervous system in seconds. Even for Vorshai, the odds are—" "Doesn't matter," Callan interrupted. "We're doing it anyway." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to find another way, but she'd spent 3 days searching for alternatives while they ran from her father's hunters, and there were none. This was the choice: die trying to stop the pylon or live long enough to watch billions burn. She'd made harder choices before. Then we go together, she said, like always. The Cinder Runner dove toward the pylon and behind them unnoticed until it was too late. The obsidian throne emerged from warp space. Her father had found them. The Vorshai boarding party hit the Cinder Runner with practiced efficiency, magnetic clamps, breaching charges. A dozen high guards in full combat armor flooding through the ruptured airlock before Sarah could even reach for a weapon. They didn't fight. There was no point. 12 against 2 in a damaged ship with failing life support. Sarah lowered her hands and felt Callan do the same through the bridge. "It's over," she said quietly. The high guards didn't speak. They simply secured restraints around Sarah's wrists and Callan's, then hauled them both through the docking tube into the Obsidian Throne's holding bay. Draven was waiting. He stood in the center of the chamber, unarmored, for once wearing simple robes of dark crimson that made him look less like a warlord and more like what he truly was. An old warrior who had watched his wife die to Shadow Eaters 40 years ago and had spent every day since trying to prevent it from happening again, even if the cure was worse than the disease. "Sarah," he said. His voice was tired. "You should have come home when I gave you the chance." "This isn't home anymore, Father." Sarah's voice was steady despite the restraints cutting into her wrists. "Home doesn't hunt its own children." "I'm not hunting you. I'm saving you from yourself." Draven gestured and technicians wheeled in a device that made Sarah's blood freeze. The neural inhibitor, larger than the one they'd used at the wedding ceremony. More powerful, designed for permanent severance, not temporary suppression. "The bond will be dissolved," Draven continued, his tone matter of fact. "The human will have his memories of Vorshai technology erased and will be returned to Earth as a gesture of goodwill. You, Sarah, will be confined to the thermal pens beneath the Arizona wastes until you remember what it means to be Vorshai." "You can't do that," Callan snarled, straining against his restraints. Two guards slammed him to his knees. "I am the warlord of the thermal territories," Draven said, finally looking at the human. "I do what is necessary to preserve our people's future, even if my daughter is too broken to understand why." The word broken hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd heard it 1,000 times, from her sisters, from high reavers, from her father every time she failed to meet his standards. But this time something inside her chest didn't crumble under the weight. It ignited. "No," Sarah said. The chamber went silent. 12 guards, a dozen technicians, her father the most powerful Vorshai on Earth, all staring at her like she'd just committed an act of cosmic blasphemy. "What did you say?" Draven's voice was dangerously quiet. Sarah raised her head, meeting her father's eyes. The scar on her face caught the light, a pale line against crimson skin. The mark he'd given her, the brand of her defection. "I said no, Father. You're not severing the bond. You're not erasing Callan's memories. You're not locking me away until I become the obedient blade you think you need." She stepped forward, and the guards actually hesitated, unsure if they should stop her. "I spent 10 years believing I was broken because I showed mercy. 10 years hating this scar because you told me it was my shame. But I was wrong." She touched the mark on her face with her restrained hands. "This scar isn't my weakness. It's proof I survived trying to kill my conscience. It's proof that when you gave me an order to murder 35 unarmed men, I chose to be something better than your weapon. And I'd make that choice again. Every time." Draven's expression hardened. "You're a child playing at philosophy while the world burns. The Shadow Eaters are consuming the outer colonies. Human resistance grows stronger every day. The Hegemony Council is fracturing. Without strength, without unity, under Vorshai authority, everything we've built will collapse into chaos." "Then let it collapse," Sarah said. Through the Cortex bridge, she felt Callan's shock, his pride, his absolute certainty in her. It gave her strength. "Your version of unity is built on fear and subjugation. It's built on purge strikes that murder civilians and weapons like the Rift Pylon that would rather destroy the galaxy than share it." "That's not strength, Father, that's cowardice." She saw it then, the flicker in his eyes. Rage, yes, but beneath it something else. Recognition. He knew she was right, had always known. He just couldn't admit it because admission meant accepting that his wife had died for nothing, that 40 years of ruthless control had solved nothing. Activate the inhibitor, Draven ordered. The technicians moved forward, attaching neural leads to Sarah's temples and Callan's. The device began to hum building charge. Sarah felt the first tendrils of static invading the cortex bridge, trying to sever the connection that bound her to the human who had chosen her when no one else would. The pain was immediate and absolute, like having her mind torn in half with rusty hooks. She felt Callan screaming through the bridge, felt his neurons firing in chaotic patterns as the inhibitor tried to erase the pathways they'd built together. But Sarah had learned something over the past 3 days. The cortex bridge wasn't just a connection, it was a choice, a constant active decision to stay linked, to share the weight. And if pain was trying to break them, then pain could become their weapon. Sarah stopped fighting the inhibitor. Instead, she did the opposite. She opened herself completely to the neural feedback, let every ounce of agony pour through the bridge and into Callan. But she also poured her strength, her thermal energy, her absolute refusal to break. And Callan, that impossible human, he took the pain and the power, and instead of collapsing, he amplified it. Sent it back through the bridge, doubled, tripled a resonance cascade that the inhibitor wasn't designed to handle. He's overloading the feedback loop, a technician shouted. Neural output is 300% above safety limits. If we don't shut it down, the inhibitor exploded. The shockwave threw everyone in the chamber backward. 2 technicians lay motionless, killed instantly by the feedback surge. Sarah felt their deaths through the bridge, collateral damage of their defiance. She forced herself not to look back. Emergency lighting failed. Power conduits burst, spraying sparks across the deck. And in the chaos and darkness, Sarah moved. She drove her shoulder into the nearest guard, using his body as leverage to snap the restraints on her wrists. Grabbed his thermal blade from its sheath, swept his legs. Rolled, came up fighting, and cut Callan free in a single fluid motion. Bug out! Callan gasped, blood streaming from his nose and ears. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed his hand and ran for the service hatch she'd noticed earlier, the one that led to the auxiliary hangar, where small courier ships sat unguarded because no one expected a prisoner to make it this far. Behind them, Draven's voice echoed through the darkness. Let them go. Sarah stumbled, shocked. She looked back. Her father stood in the wreckage of the inhibitor chamber, backlit by emergency lighting, looking older than she'd ever seen him. Sir, one of the guards asked, confused. I said let them go, Draven repeated. Through the smoke and flickering lights, he looked directly at his daughter. If my daughter wants to die, proving she's right, I won't stop her. But when the pylon activates and the Shadow Eaters consume everything she's trying to save, she'll know. She'll know I was right and her mercy was just weakness, wearing a prettier name. Sarah met her father's eyes across the ruined chamber, saw the challenge there, the certainty that she would fail. But beneath it, she saw something else, something that made her breath catch. Grief. He wasn't looking at her the way he looked at a failed soldier or a broken weapon. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her mother's memorial stone, like he was already mourning. You have her eyes, Draven said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sparking conduits. Your mother's. She would have made the same choice you did, in that cave. Sarah's throat tightened. Then why punish me for it? Because I couldn't save her. The words came out like they'd been torn from somewhere deep. And I thought if I made you hard enough, strong enough, carved away everything soft, you wouldn't end up like she did. Wouldn't die for strangers who'd never remember your name. He turned away. Go. Prove me wrong or prove me right. Either way, you're no longer my problem. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was release. You're wrong, Father, Sarah said quietly, and I'm going to prove it. Then she ran. They stole a scout ship, one of the fast, needle-thin couriers used for high-priority messages. Sarah pushed it past safe limits, the hull screaming in protest as they dove back toward the rift pylon. He let us go, Callan said. He was slumped in his co-pilot seat, barely conscious from the neural trauma. Why bow? Because he thinks we're going to fail, Sarah replied. He thinks the moment we get close to that pylon, we'll realize he was right about everything and we'll come crawling back. Will we? Sarah looked at the mark on her wrist, at the bond that had survived a neural inhibitor designed to tear minds apart. At this human who had stood with her against impossible odds, not because he had to, but because he'd chosen to. No, she said. We're going to destroy his weapon and save millions of lives. And then we're going to build something better than the empire he's trying to preserve. The pylon loomed before them, kilometers of obsidian and void matter pulsing with malevolent energy. Shadow Eaters swarmed its surface like insects drawn to the dimensional terror bleeding from its core. Sarah brought the scout ship in fast, crashed through the pylon's outer defenses, and slammed into a docking bay in what could barely be called a landing. The hull crumpled. Alarms screamed, but they were inside. The interior of the pylon was a cathedral of nightmares. Walls made of frozen smoke, floors transparent, revealing an infinite drop into swirling darkness. And everywhere that low-frequency hum that made Sarah's teeth ache and her thermal senses scream warnings. The emitter is at the top, she said, pointing up the central spire. We climb. They climbed. Every step was a battle, not against shadow eaters, though those swarmed too, against the pylon itself, sending psychic assaults designed to break intruders before they could reach the core. Sarah saw visions of her father standing over her with that obsidian stylus, carving the scar deeper and deeper, until there was nothing left of her face except shame. Saw her sisters laughing as she failed another combat trial. Saw the High Reavers declaring her defective, broken, worthless. You were right to hate yourself, her father's ghost whispered. You were right to believe you were weak. Mercy is the indulgence of those who don't understand what survival costs. Sarah's legs faltered. She stumbled, nearly fell. The visions were so real, so convincing. Maybe she was broken. Maybe she'd been fooling herself this whole time. Then Callan's hand gripped her shoulder. Through the cortex bridge, she felt his thoughts. Not words, just the memory of a cave 10 years ago. 35 soldiers watching a Vorshai warrior snap her blade and choose their lives over her orders. Look at me, Callan said, his voice cutting through the psychic static. You're not broken, Sarah. You're the only one who isn't. You saved my life twice. You stood against an empire for strangers. This scar isn't your shame. It's your father's failure to break you. Sarah looked at him, at this scarred, battered human who believed in her with a faith that defied logic. And she believed him. They reached the emitter chamber, a sphere of pure obsidian floating in a cage of white-hot plasma pulsing with the energy needed to tear reality apart. We touch it simultaneously, Sarah said, her voice steady now. Channel our combined neural energy through the bridge. Create a feedback loop that shatters the pylon's synchronization. Callan looked at the sphere, looked at her. This is going to kill us, isn't it? Probably. Then it's a good thing stubbornness is my only real skill. Sarah almost smiled. Then she raised her hand toward the sphere. Callan mirrored her movement. On three, she asked. On three. 1. Her heart hammered against her ribs. 2. Through the bridge, she felt his pulse steady and certain. 3. They touched the sphere. The universe didn't explode. It simply stopped existing. Sarah was no longer in her body. She was the cortex bridge itself, pure neural energy, flowing between her consciousness and Callan's. And surrounding them, crushing them, was the void. A vast, hungry darkness that wanted to swallow every star, every thought, every spark of defiance. It reached for them with tendrils made of absolute zero and cosmic despair. Reached to consume them, add them to the nothing. Is this how it ends? Sarah wondered, her sense of self fragmenting. Is this how we lose? No. Callan's voice or the memory of it burned through the dark. This is how we choose. And Sarah understood. The void wasn't stronger than them. It was just older, more patient. It had been waiting at the edge of reality for eons, waiting for the chance to rush in and erase everything. But she was Sarah, princess of the Vorshai bloodline, bearer of the scar her father gave her for showing mercy, and she chose to push back, not with fire, not with violence. With the same stubborn, impossible courage she'd shown in a cave 10 years ago, when she broke her blade rather than murder 35 men. She channeled everything into the bridge, every moment of pain, every second of shame, every year of loneliness, but also every instant of choosing mercy over cruelty, hope over despair, connection over isolation. And Callan, he met her in the middle. His grief for fallen comrades, his fear of never being enough, his desperate need to believe that one person's choice could matter, could change things. Together they became something the void couldn't consume, not because they were stronger, because they refused to stop burning. The pylon groaned. The obsidian walls began to crack, white light bleeding through fissures in the frozen smoke. The sphere in their hands started to vibrate faster and faster until it shattered into a million fragments of impossibly sharp nothing. And then the world came back. Sarah collapsed on the fractured floor, every nerve ending screaming. Her vision was gray. Her hearing was gone except for a high-pitched ringing. She tasted copper and ash. 20 meters away, Callan lay motionless. His skin was the color of old bone. His chest wasn't moving. "No," Sarah whispered. The word came out as a broken rasp. She crawled toward him, armor scraping against stone. Her thermal senses were burned out, useless. She could barely move. But she reached him, pulled his head into her lap with shaking hands. "Callan," she said, louder. "Callan, wake up. You don't get to die. Not after everything. Not after you taught me I wasn't broken." Through the Cortex bridge there was nothing. Just cold, empty silence. Sarah felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, something deeper. The last wall she'd built around herself, the final defense against caring too much. Tears fell, copper-scented liquid that dripped onto Callan's face. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I'm scared to do this alone. Please don't make me be brave by myself." She pressed her hands to his chest, funneled every scrap of thermal energy she had left into him, poured her life force through the bridge, trying to jumpstart his heart, trying to drag him back from wherever he'd gone. "Live," she commanded, begged. "Live, you stubborn human. You chose me when no one else would. You stood with me against the entire empire. You don't get to leave now." For one terrible moment, nothing happened. Then Callan gasped. A wet, desperate sound. His eyes flickered open, bloodshot and dazed, but impossibly beautifully blue. "Did we win?" he rasped. Sarah laughed. It came out as half a sob. "Yes, you idiot. We won." She looked up. Through the pylon's shattered walls, she could see the sky filling with ships. Thousands of them. The Hegemony Fleet, the U.S. Legion, Vorshai war galleys from the splinter clans, all converging on the Rift Zone, weapons hot, ready for the final battle. At the front of the formation was the Obsidian Throne. Her father had come to finish what he started. Sarah's comm unit crackled to life. Static, then Draven's voice. "Sarah, the pylon signal has ceased. The rift is closing." "We destroyed it, Father," Sarah said. Her voice was weak but steady. "And we're not going to let you build another one." Silence on the other end, long enough that Sarah thought he'd cut the connection. "Then Haum, the High Council is calling for your execution. They say you've doomed the Vorshai to a slow death in a galaxy of weaklings who don't understand strength." "Then tell them to look at their sensors," Sarah replied. "Tell them to look at the humans and Vorshai standing side by side in this fleet. We aren't dying, Father. We're finally learning what real strength looks like." Another silence. Sarah watched through the pylon's broken walls as the Obsidian Throne's weapons stayed dark. As the massive flagship slowly, deliberately turned away from the Rift Zone, the Hegemony Fleet followed. Not retreating, just leaving. Her father had blinked. "He's gone," Callan said, staring at the departing ships. "He actually let us win." Sarah shook her head. "He didn't let us win. We proved him wrong. Proved that the fire he was trying to protect had already moved on. He's the past now, Callan." She looked at the mark on her wrist, glowing with soft white light. Neither Vorshai crimson nor human blue. Something new. Something they'd created together. We're the future. 1 year later, the Unity Spire rose from the rebuilt ruins of New Phoenix like a promise carved in steel and stone. Sarah stood on the central podium, looking out at the crowd that filled the plaza below. 50,000 people, human and Vorshai, the ones they'd saved, the ones who had chosen to stay and build something new. She wore ceremonial armor polished until it shone, but she hadn't tried to hide the scar. The brand her father had given her gleamed in the Arizona sunlight, a pale line she'd spent 10 years hating and 1 year learning to wear with pride. Beside her, Callan stood in the blue and gold uniform of the Unity Diplomatic Corps. Still lean, still scarred, but no longer running. They'd spent a year building this moment, negotiating with 12 planetary governments, drafting the treaty that would abolish purge protocols and enshrine the principle that mercy wasn't weakness. It was the hardest thing Sarah had ever done, and she'd done it. Ready? Callan asked quietly. Sarah nodded, stepped forward to the microphone. The crowd fell silent. 10 years ago, she began, her voice carrying across the plaza. My father gave me this scar for showing mercy. He told me it was my badge of cowardice. He told me that a true warrior never hesitates, never questions, never allows compassion to interfere with duty. She touched the mark on her face. For 10 years I believed him. I hid. I trained in exile. I told myself I was broken because I couldn't be the blade he wanted me to be. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces watching her. Human, Vorshai, old soldiers and young children. People who had survived hell and chosen to keep living. But I was wrong. This scar isn't my shame, it's my strength. It's proof that when I was ordered to murder 35 unarmed men, I chose mercy instead. It's proof that when I was told to let 50,000 civilians burn, I chose to fight for them. It's proof that when the entire empire wanted me dead for defying their version of order, I chose hope instead of fear. She raised her wrist, showing the Cortex bridge mark that bound her to Callan. Today we sign the Unity Accord, not because we're no longer afraid of each other, but because we've decided that some things, connection, compassion, the choice to build instead of destroy, are worth more than the safety of isolation. We've decided that being together, flawed and struggling and uncertain, is better than being alone in the ashes of the empire we were too afraid to change. Sarah took the stylus from the attendant, signed her name at the bottom of the treaty, bold, decisive, final. I am Sarah. I was called broken for showing mercy, but I stand here today as proof that mercy is the strongest choice we can make, that scars are not marks of shame. They're proof we survived our battles and chose to keep fighting for something better. The applause started slowly, then built. A wave of sound that shook the foundations of the spire, 50,000 voices raised in affirmation. Sarah stepped back from the podium. Callan took her hand, the marks on their wrists pulsing in synchronous rhythm. You did it, he said. Change the galaxy. Sarah shook her head. We did it. You chose the broken blade when no one else would. You taught me that being chosen isn't about being perfect. It's about being worthy of someone's faith. She looked at the scar in her reflection on the polished podium surface, the mark that had defined her for so long. I used to hide this, she said quietly, tried to keep my hair forward, angle my face away from cameras. I was ashamed of what it represented. And now it's my banner, Sarah said. She turned to face the crowd again, the scar catching the light. The mark of a warrior who chose mercy over orders, hope over fear, love over empire. What happens now? Callan asked. Sarah looked out at Unity Spire, at the city they'd built from ashes and stubborn faith, at the million lights representing lives they'd saved. Now we build the galaxy where broken means brave enough to break the rules, she said, where scars are proof we survived, where one person's choice to show mercy can change everything. She took Callan's hand, the Cortex bridge humming between them, warm, steady, unbreakable. This is Sarah, she said, speaking to no one and everyone. I was the scarred princess no one wanted, until one veteran chose me, and together we chose hope. The crowd roared its approval. The Unity Accord was signed, the Purge protocols were abolished, and standing on a podium in the Arizona desert, a Vorshai princess who had spent 28 years believing she was broken finally understood the truth. She had never been broken. She had simply been waiting for the moment when her mercy would matter more than her father's strength, when her choice would save millions instead of just 35, when her scar would become the symbol not of shame, but of the courage it takes to be kind in a galaxy built on cruelty. Sarah looked at the mark on her wrist one final time. Then she turned and walked into the future hand in hand with the human who had chosen her, ready to face whatever came next. Together, always together.